Okay, back with you. And I have an article here from the Epoch Times. It was written by Daniel Nucio. He apparently was a student or a teacher in training, a professor in training at the Northern Illinois University. And he wrote this called Some People Will Follow Authority, quote, the science to their doom. And he relates to us a story about when he was at Northern Illinois University when the entire COVID hysteria broke out. And he basically starts out by talking about Marian Keech. She was a Midwestern housewife, and she prepared for the end of the world and started kind of a cult following. And he goes to that saying, you know, that never happened. I mean, this was in 1954. Everything that she sought to become true, the mess that she thought was going to happen, the risk to the entire world leaving just failed. It was a prophecy failure, but people bought into the hysteria. And he kind of relates that to what he saw happening, at least in his world, when it came to COVID. And he wrote this. He says, almost 70 years later, he's talking from the time of Marian Keech and her theory that the world was going to end. He says, I was standing on the third floor hall of the biology building at the Northern Illinois University one afternoon in the final days of the before times, he calls it. A fellow grad student, a professor, and I joked about our incompetent governor. Well, you can kind of see where he lies politically. Let's be honest. That's right up there. He calls Pritzker incompetent, which actually I think a lot of Democrats and independents would also agree. I think they all think he's incompetent too. Even if they still may want to vote for him, I think that they do understand he is incompetent. At least I do. Anyway, they were joking about the governor and sycophantic university bureaucrats that eagerly sought to be among the first to carry out the governor's orders for the university. He says, we laughed at how competing public health officials couldn't decide if we were supposed to stay 3 feet or 6 feet apart during casual conversation. We marveled at the possibility that our overeager administrators might start asking us to attend meetings with colleagues down the hall via Zoom when we could. You know what? That actually happened. Just why not just gather in the conference room, he says, or go to a colleague's office down the hall. We were biologists, or at least biologists in training. We found it absurd that so many people were overreacting to what even then seemed like a bad case of the flu that posed little threat to anyone save the very old or very ill. Then our university bureaucrats announced that they would be extending spring break for a week and that classes would be temporarily moved online once they resumed. Does everybody remember that? I distinctly remember that because I had kids in college at that time. And I mean, that's exactly, we all thought that they were going to go back to school. In fact, my son took a spring break, took an extra week of spring break, and then went back to his college thinking that he's going to have to go to class in person, only to then be relegated to his apartment for the rest of the semester. And then we went and picked him up, and he graduated with no ceremony, no nothing. But everybody assumed this was, like they said, 2 weeks to, flatten the curve, basically stuff. And it ended up just becoming 2 years of a nightmare. So anyway, this is exactly what they thought. He says, yet still very few professors or grad students I encountered as I wandered about the halls of the biology building during that final week or two of quasi-normalcy expressed any unease or discomfort engaging in casual conversation in person. No one was measuring the distance between themselves and others. No one was wearing a mask. Several of us with microbe backgrounds had actually worked with potentially pathogenic fungi or bacterial spores in the past and knew, for the most part, that most masks were pretty ineffective at stopping the spread of respiratory pathogens. Yes, we knew this. We knew this 2 years ago. Sorry. We knew it 2 years ago. The experts certainly did. So he goes on to write, when I reached out to my various supervisors at the time about my willingness to remain on site and continue to be productive through whatever circumstances were to come, no one really pushed back too hard, at least not until we were all more or less barred from our labs by gubernatorial fiat. Even then, though, there still seemed to remain some subtle skepticism over the reorganization of society. This seemed to extend beyond me and the small circle of friends with whom I stayed in touch and occasionally risked mild to moderate illness and the possible ire of old man Fauci by venturing out for an in-person happy hour when our school and state would have preferred we stayed home. It wasn't until after we were more or less allowed to return to campus I learned most of my remaining peers and professors had come to wholeheartedly embrace what we had been deriding only a few months prior. That's the point. That's the point. When this all started, people who worked with pathogens, people who were biologists, people who understood the risks in this realm, they were ready to get back to normal. And then after everything was shut down and the world went hysterical over this, even they bought into the hysteria. That is the problem. And he goes on to write, the reason for that about face I witnessed in so many of my former colleagues was something over which I initially puzzled for quite a bit. As time went on, thanks to the early work by researchers such as Stanford epidemiologist John Ioannidis, COVID seemed less scary, not more. Additionally, we all presumably had the summer to brush up on the classic pandemic planning commentaries from nearly 15 years earlier when the possibility of an H5N1 avian influenza outbreak outweighed heavily on the minds of those in government and public policy. He says a group from the RAND Center for Domestic and International Health Security, a team at the Center for Biosecurity at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center in Baltimore, Maryland, and a pair of assessments for national and international interventions by representatives from the WHO, all largely agreed that support for such measures as lockdowns, masks, and social distancing lacked evidence. Let's be clear here. We knew this, according to him, easily 18 months ago, knew all of this. He went on to say, similar assessments published in the period between the H5N1 scare and the COVID-19 pandemic in journals such as Epidemics and Emerging Infectious Diseases had been largely consistent with the opinions of those earlier pandemic planners. The latter actually came out in May of 2020. We've known this for a long time. Excuse me. He says, though, he goes on to say, he talks a little bit more, and I encourage you to read this article. Again, it's in the Epoch Times. They published it today, 2/14/22 is when I'm reading it. He goes on to say that instead of what I found among biologists in training was quite the opposite. Instead, I discovered a profound lack of curiosity regarding the science behind the rules that now governed us. Conversations about infection fatality rates, masks, and models at best had the air of a Solomon Asch experiment. At worst, such conversations were met with a certain hostility or at least condescension toward the idea that one might want evidence for which had been proclaimed by Pope Fauci, the Church of the CDC, or quote unquote, the science. At a certain point, whenever I set foot on campus, I honestly came to half expect Rob Serling to be smoking a cigarette in some black and white corner of one of our labs delivering a narration. I mean, this is just such a remarkable article about even those who know better, who knew the science, who read the studies, who do the work, bought in to just the government mandates, brought into the, Governor Pritzker's idea that we needed to stay locked down despite the evidence of that. That is the problem here. And that is why I say to people who are listening, look, you have got to get to your quote unquote bureaucrats, your state reps, your gubernatorial candidates, your school board members, your superintendents, all these public policy people who have known for well over a year now what was really the people who were really at risk were those that were most vulnerable to COVID. They know lockdowns don't work. We have study after study saying the lockdowns don't work. We've never seen a legitimate study that say that masks are effective, especially the cloth masks that kids are wearing at school right now. And until these people admit that they were wrong and apologize for that, and admit that they've bought into the hysteria rather than using common sense, until they admit that, I really just don't know how we can go on. They don't just get a pass. Sorry, Kristen Fitzgerald, president of the Naperville 203 school board. Sorry, you don't just get a pass for acting that way towards residents, You don't just get a pass for 2 years of this nonsense. None of these superintendents should get a pass. And when I come back, boy, do I have a story for you about the D87 superintendent and the principal at Glenbard West. Stay tuned for that one.